Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that while you feed your stomachs, you can also feed your mind here at this Power of Sharing Our Stories panel and discussion. My name is Zinhle Essamuah. I'm a reporter with NBC News Now, and I have the deep, deep pleasure and privilege of discussing the power of sharing our stories with Azar Nafisi. She is an Iranian-American writer and professor of English literature, best known for her national bestseller, Reading Lolita in Tehran, a memoir in books. And her latest work, which I have here and you can also get, is Read Dangerously, the Subversive Power of Literature in Troubled Times, which is quite timely. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure having this conversation.
Yes. So if you can just start by maybe sharing a story with us, whatever that looks like for you.
I could share a little bit of my experiences while I was with stories, how I came to be captured by them. I'm not exaggerating when I say that I couldn't have survived without reading and writing, that it became a survival mechanism for me. And my first acquaintance with stories was when I was about 3 years old. And each night my father would tell me a story. And he was very democratic in the way he told his stories. One night we would be with our epic poet, Ferdowsi, and go back 1,000 years ago. The other night we'll travel with the Little Prince to France. The other night to England with Alice in Wonderland. The other night to Denmark with Little Match Girl, to Italy with Pinocchio, to Turkey with Mullah Nasreddin, to America with Charlotte's Web. So that sort of democratic nature of imagination, I think I instinctively got it, that I can sit in my little room in Tehran and the whole world will come to me. I don't need to even walk out. So before I saw these countries, I had already been there through their stories. And then I was sent very early on at the age of 13 to England to continue my education. And I realized how easy it is to lose everything you call home. That well, I went through a war and a revolution, but a hurricane, planes are on my mind very much because I have a flight tomorrow, a plane crash, you know. So you need a portable world that you can take with you anywhere you go, that no one can take away from you. And that is what I did when I went to England. I took 3 books of poetry. Iran lives on its poetry, identifies its nationality with its poetry. And 2 of them were by our classical poets, Rumi and Hafiz, and one by this feminist Iranian poet, Forough Farrokhzad. So I'm not, and I made my home in England and later on in America through my kith and kin, through my friends like Jane Austen and Auden and Melville and Toni Morrison, and I'm talking about my absolute favorite right now. I'm very promiscuous when it comes to books. Like, for example, my current love, and he has been with me since my last book, Republic of Imagination, to this book, James Baldwin. I mean, boy, do we miss him in these times, you know. And anyway, I made my home through the stories in England and America. And when I came back to Iran, everything had changed. We had gone through a totalitarian revolution. And to give you an idea of how, cut me if I'm...
No, this is the power of sharing your story, sharing yours.
The totalitarian revolution had completely changed what I used to call Iran. And just to give you an idea, the first thing they did, of course, was with laws. And every totalitarian mindset, including the ones in democratic societies, their first targets are women, minorities, and culture. That is, before that regime changed the constitution of the country and made new laws, they annulled the family protection law, which gave women protection at work and family. Iran had some of the most progressive laws for women, especially for working women. They had daycares, the government daycares, and very much different from now. This government, the first thing they did was annul the laws regarding women. Women, the age of marriage for females in Iran used to be 18. They reduced it to 9. Now, anyone who tells me this is my culture, and not the great poets and philosophers, that my culture is marriage at the age of 9 for females, I'll say the culture of the West is not its great poets and philosophers. It is witch burning and inquisition and slavery. I mean, every culture has something to be ashamed of. And every culture, every people have the right to fight against what they see as an intrusion into their lives, against oppression. When I went back to Iran, their first targets were universities, places of knowledge, because you are in the business of truth. And literature is in business of truth in another way. And truth is very dangerous to totalitarian mindsets. The way they come, the way they insinuate themselves into the society is through lying. The bigger the lie, the more comfortable they feel in it.
Truth threatens that lie.
Yeah. So it was they arrested and jailed many writers and poets and journalists. They killed and assassinated them, many of them. So in a country like Iran, literature is not just for entertainment. It is a way of looking at the world and changing the world. And that makes it very dangerous. There are some experiences I want to talk about, but I talk too much, so.
No, I mean, that's spot on into what I wanted to ask you about next, which is, to you, what are the biggest threats to sharing stories? Because I think you've touched on how impactful individual narratives can be in threatening regimes and politics. What do you think threatens storytelling? What are the biggest threats to it?
What threatens storytelling?
Yeah.
Well, in a country like Iran, it was mainly the government. The first thing they do is confiscate your history and your story. And so the way to liberation, the way to take control of reality is through taking control of your story. Telling your story becomes an alternative to what the government does.
What about other contexts where maybe you have more freedom to tell your story, like the United States?
Yeah, that now, United States is a different story. At the end of reading Lolita, I mentioned that I was worried my students were having too rosy a view of the West because they were living under such oppression. And I wanted them to know that things are much more complex than that. And I had quoted Saul Bellow, those who survive the ordeal of Holocaust, how will they survive the ordeal of freedom? Because at some point in this country, we forgot that freedom is an ordeal, that it needs to be nurtured and nourished every single day. In this country, the enemy doesn't take you to jail, not right now. They burn books and they ban books, but they still are not taking us in jail. But they don't torture you, they don't kill you. But there is something that kills culture, that kills imagination and ideas that is very potent, and that is indifference. That is complacency and indifference. As Bellow said, what threatens democracy is our sleeping consciousness and our atrophy of feeling. And you mentioned something yesterday that stayed with me. You talked about how imagination and ideas are part of our humanity. Mm-hmm. You know, so over here we dehumanize ourselves. Mm-hmm. when we ignore literature and art, when we look at it as in such a commercial way. You know, our children are told, these universities I go and talk at, most students come, not most students, some students come and tell me, our parents say, don't go into philosophy or literature. It doesn't make money. Who says you go into the university to make money, for heaven's sake? I mean, in a democracy, every single person in a democracy has the right to free, good, quality public education and public health. This is not socialism or communism. This is what a democracy does. Education is the foundation of any democracy. And this country that was built on an idea, this country where the fights against oppression went back to this idea constantly. You have the founders with the Declaration of Independence, then look at Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, how they would use these ideas against the way the founders themselves lived. And up to MLK, and I hope up to now. And so it makes me literally scared to see how knowledge is being denigrated, how we think arts and literature should become handmaidens to politics. And in a place like this, especially, we have to voice our protest that it can't be this way.
And it's interesting to me, you mentioned protests, because I noticed in your book, you said in response to the George Floyd murder that sparked widespread protests around the country and world, you turned to literature for learning and resistance. I wonder, as almost equipping, what does that look like? How do you use stories and literature beyond enriching your mind, but for action?
You know, it becomes into action. Imagination, I mean, literature and arts do not make policies, but they create the mindset that makes policies. And they create the essence of fiction is democratic.
How do you mean?
The structure of fiction is a democratic fiction. Every character in a great novel, every character in a great novel has a voice. You as an author have to go under the skin of every character. Even the villain gets to have his or her own voice. And a dictatorial author is the one that imposes his own voice into every character, depriving them of their identity, which is what a totalitarian mindset does. They want to refashion you, you know. And so just by telling your story, you're resisting. I always tell people that for me, resisting the Islamic Republic and now resisting this wave of totalitarian mindset is not a political thing.
What is it?
It is an existential thing. Because when I was living in Iran, as a woman, as a person who believes in human rights, as a writer, a teacher, and a reader, and a mother and a friend, I was being assaulted. I was being told, you can't be this kind of a woman. They even controlled the way we dress in public.
A story was being put on you.
Yeah. So what could I do at that time? My only strength against them was my knowledge, you know. And I couldn't go into the classroom and tell my students, we don't have freedom of choice. This regime is so terrible. Everybody would know that. So what would I do? One of the writers everyone thinks is very conservative. In fact, I put her side by side with Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston, is Jane Austen. 18th century and 19th century begins with this new form, which is the novel. And at the center of most of these novels is a woman who says no to the dictates of her parents and of her society, to the dictates of the authority, and says, I choose the man that I love. And you know, at that time in Europe and in England, there were women were completely dependent on men. They had to get married in order to survive, you know. And so for Elizabeth Bennet, saying no to Mr. Darcy is a big thing. It's a huge thing. And we still have, in every great novel, the idea of freedom of choice. And at the center of the novel, it is that idea and that democracy of voices. It just breaks my heart today when even those of us who are fighting against a lack of freedom of speech sometimes fall into the trap of becoming like our enemies.
In which way?
Talking like them, censoring others. You know, I don't want to politicize this meeting, but who exposes Donald Trump more than Donald Trump himself? Let the bastard talk. Because that is how he's, I mean, I was watching the committee, the January 6th committee. And what they do, they bring these Republicans, you know, and it is much more difficult to refute Liz Cheney than it is you and me, you know. And the whole point is that Trump up to now has been going around making
false claims about the 2020 election.
Now they are bringing quotations from him to show that, you know,
the story that he was telling,
that it is all fake, you know. And so what I'm saying is that what we need in this country is a national debate. What we need in this country is another Martin Luther King. Of course, in my field, what we need is another James Baldwin. Baldwin used to say, ignorance allied to power is the worst enemy of justice. You are educating people through giving them the news, giving them the facts of reality, you know. And literature and arts are educating people through putting them within the experiences you're talking about, you know.
Do you think we're focused? You gave a critique in your book that I thought was interesting, and you said in the West there's a growing obsession with the culture of entertainment.
Yes.
Do you think we're focused on the right stories right now? And if not, where should we be focusing?
I think that the right stories are imposing themselves on us.
How do you mean?
Well, because we were so complacent. When they changed Roe v. Wade, I thought, oh my God, I mean, didn't we know that these rights are not God-given, that they can be taken away from us? We should be alert and try to prevent it from happening before it happens, you know. And right now we are in that condition where the circumstances force us to look reality in the eye. Well, all the protests around guns, around women, around minority rights, all of these stories are coming out of them that we need to pay attention to. And then there are stories from the past. I keep reading the past. I am amazed. Like, look at someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Look at Harriet Tubman. I mean, these people lived in far worse conditions than us, and they are just absolutely amazing. They're so relevant today, you know. And we need to tell our children to reread the history of this country and see its complexity, see its contradictions, you know.
And you talk about children reading, and I'm reminded of the title of your book, Read Dangerously, and we're in this context where books are being banned around the country. What do you think the implications are for that?
Well, reading dangerously, I was thinking when you read dangerously, it's not just dangerously in relationship to other people. It is in relationship to yourself. Sometimes fiction tells you, like the news, it tells you uncomfortable truths that you don't want to see in yourself. One of the writers I talk about in this book, the Lebanese writer, Elias Khoury, in his book, Gate of the Sun, he talks about, I look into the mirror and I see the enemy. And somehow, both the news and fiction become a mirror in which you see yourself, and you don't always like yourself.
And you think that's part of why people reject these stories?
Yeah, people want, how many times a week do you hear people saying, I'm not comfortable with this? You know? And people evade. Baldwin says we hate because we want to cover up our pain. You know, and that is what we're doing. We want to constantly evade the truth that is looking us in the eye until the truth literally comes into our eyes, you know. And so that is what worries me right now. And the United States is at a crossroads. This is a transition period. We can go either way.
What are the ways?
Pardon me?
You said we can go either way. Which ways?
Well, one way is towards a more genuinely multicultural society, a society that expands the rights, a society that is not aggressive but self-confident. There's a difference between confidence and aggression. You know, and a society that relearns how to speak to one another. You know, how to, you know, I always think that violence is a sign of weakness, not strength. Women, minorities, and those in culture and journalists, they should know that they are being harassed and oppressed, not because they're weak, not because they're victims, but because they pose a real threat to the establishment. You know, and what do? The only language that the establishment knows is a language of violence. So they will increase violence, but that increase in violence means increase in lack of confidence. In Iran, I ask in reading dangerously, I mentioned the case of Salman Rushdie. You know that Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa. Now, what did Salman Rushdie have, which is so dangerous? What do those Persian writers have that is so dangerous that they need to be killed? As we speak, they are in jail, and recently just one poet was murdered. Now, they only have their words. That is all. And these words are so dangerous, so potent, that the most powerful men in the world want to kill you, you know. So I once saw Salman Rushdie and I was trying to explain to him this concept, but he thought I meant it was a good thing that they were going to kill you. Because I was trying to say that in Iran, whenever you go to jail, it's a badge of honor. And I was saying that they bestowed the greatest honor on you by issuing a fatwa against you. But he thought that I had mentioned that you deserve to die. You know.
The importance of clear stories, yes. Yes, and that's a sentiment I've even seen echoed. You know, we've seen many Mexican journalists killed in just this last year, and one of the editors said, you bring your guns and all we have is our pen and paper. So I think that's an important insight. I could keep asking you questions, but I want to open it up to the audience for any questions you have about the power of sharing stories in our context, in the States, abroad, and just the general implications. We've got one in the back, and one up front right here, and then one right there.
Hi, my name is Simone. I'm thoroughly appreciative to be a part of this conversation. Part of my path is sharing a very controversial side of a perspective. So I talk a lot about body liberation, diversity of body types, and health at every size. And a lot of times when I present that perspective, I met with a lot of violence, which is kind of like what you were saying about how when all you have is your words and your perspectives, and people kind of combat that with being really angry and almost to the point where it feels, fairly violent. So I'm curious to know, in what ways do you stay motivated to continue speaking, even in the face of that strong adversity and people presenting the exact opposite and kind of using that as their truth, when you know that your story is going to be impactful to people regardless?
I have to tell you, I forgot to bring my hearing aids.
No problem, and that's what I'm here for. So
I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for sharing. And the question was, this speaker does a lot of work around body positivity and health for every size person, and finds that in their activism, they still get a lot of pushback, and in some ways that feels very violent. And so the question is, as someone sharing your story, when you're facing this consistent onslaught of violence, how do you respond? How do you stay resilient? Does that feel accurate for you?
I know it's so difficult. I mean, you're at the center of action, so you have experienced it. And I sometimes feel whatever I say is a platitude and not something that. But what I have learned through the Islamic Republic is that we need to focus on what MLK used to say, love. We need to focus rather than letting, when I was in Iran, I was feeling so enraged and so helpless that I would just hate them. And I realized that just hating them would paralyze me. Have you experienced hate? I mean, if you have experienced hate, you know how paralyzing it is. And how much it makes me be like my enemy, because there were days when I would walk around and say, just let them die. I want them to die, And that didn't work. But what worked in Iran, and Iran is really a case study in many ways, especially the women of that country. If you don't wear the mandatory veil in Iran, you have jail time. Right now, there are women in jail for 16 or 27 years because they took their hijab off. And 86 lashes, they flog you, yes, and monetary fine. So what did these women do? They would go into jail, they would be flogged, they would come back into the streets and wear their weapons of mass destruction, which is their lipstick, letting their hair show, or taking their hijab off. My friends from Iran are constantly sending me. They banned women singing and they banned dancing. So what do? The young people, especially in Iran, they go into parks and into metros and public transportation, like America in the 50s, is segregated. Women sit behind men, and they dance. There are so many videos. A lot of times in my talks, I bring the videos of young people dancing. So by becoming more themselves, by focusing on what they want, not what is taken away from them, they felt empowered. And I know how hard it is, and I empathize with you. There are moments of hate, but I try to focus on being who I am.
It's like saying that you being unapologetically radical, like that is the work.
It's almost like saying being unapologetically you, being firm in your mission and vision is the work.
Yes.
Is the resistance.
Yes. It is that self-confidence.
Thank you. We have one back there. We have two back there, actually. And a third.
How you doing? Thank you for sharing this. I've learned so much. My question, I'm Yasha Morgan, by the way. My question's about story fatigue. As in, like, when you share your story so much, now your story is no longer tied to you as an individual, but more than what it represents. And now telling your story feels fatigued because there's no longer a personal connection.
So the question is around story fatigue. When you maybe share your story or your experience so much that in a way it becomes separate from you or detached, and it becomes exhausting to share. Does that feel honest to your question? Yes.
Wow. Yeah. That was a point I had not thought about, but it does exist. But then you push back and you withdraw, and then you go back to your stories. I haven't had that experience, but I can imagine it. I think that whatever I do, I used to tell my children, please choose what you love and what you're passionate about. So story fatigue won't stay with you if you have the passion, I think. Very unsatisfactory answer.
And I heard you say earlier, too, sort of emphasizing the individual, being personal about your story and not feeling that it has to represent many people. I see one back there and another that we had as well.
Hi, Evelyn. Thank you so much for being here. My question was, when and how were you first introduced to the Black literary canon, and what impact has it had on your life personally, and what impact has it had on your work as a writer?
Well, you know, I'm a child of the 70s, and I was very militant at that time. And I was against the government in Iran, but participated in all the protests around the civil rights movement and the women's movement. But it was really when I came back to live in America. At that time, I was a student. And, you know, we had this world that was talking about reality, but was not part of reality. I mean, in terms of our protests, we didn't go deep enough into the lives, the real lives of the people. I mean, people did, activists. I'm talking about myself. When I returned to United States, and while I was living in Iran, I noticed that how much I share with the African-American writers. And I started reading them methodically. Zora Neale Hurston, for example, and Toni Morrison, Ralph Ellison. The first thing I published in Iran were translation of 2 poems by Langston Hughes. The first introduction I wrote to a book, I had taken with me Richard Wright's American Hunger. And I had that translated into Farsi. But it was really coming back. And realizing that at every juncture, the political, social, and cultural changes, how dependent they were on political, cultural, and social changes of the African-American people and of minorities as a whole. You know, that I hadn't known that before. I was against slavery. I mean, my God, who wouldn't be? I was against segregation, but I didn't realize how much this is in the fabric of this society, you know. And so in this later, I went with caution because I needed to know before I spoke. So I finished my book, which is on America, Republic of Imagination, with the epilogue on Baldwin. And then, then I thought the conversation with Baldwin is not over. So I end my new book again with a chapter on Baldwin, whom I think is the most humane writer I have seen. He's really cool.
And it sounds like you're advocating for, in the journey of sharing your own story, not losing sight of the stories before.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Thank you.
This lady.
Oh, let's do one, and then there was someone who had a question. I don't know if you still do. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. As you know, storytelling is a lot more democratic today without so many filters as when you write a novel. How do you think that democratization of storytelling is affecting us as a society?
I hope, well, I mean, the democratization of stories, like democratization of a lot of other things that technology has brought to us, I think is a good thing. It is a good thing that everybody now can write their story. But it doesn't become fiction. I mean, there is a room for fiction with that structure. When I write my own story, either I'm fictionalizing to a bit, I mean structurally fictionalizing by telling a story. And so I think we need both of them. We need the novelists and we need the storytellers. The one does not exclude the other. So many things right now are in a process of transition, and I think so many things can live side by side rather than excluding the other.
Thank you.
Hi, you had mentioned that young people should be reading more literature about American history. Could you recommend one or two books that I can tell my 19-year-old son to read?
Really?
So you recommended that young people read more about American history. Are there maybe 1, 2, 3 books you recommend anyone here suggest to young people in their lives? She said she has a 19-year-old.
That's a great question. I started learning, I do 2 things with history. One, read the original works. I mean, the works of, for example, if I'm thinking about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I first read her.
Not
so
people writing about
Yeah.
her. Okay.
And there are a lot of good books about these people. But to read them, to get their voice before going anywhere else. My favorite historians have been, just to name 2 of them, Ellis and Gordon Wood. But there are so many others that I'm missing.
Wonderful. I think we can do 2 more. There's one in the back and one up here. Thank you.
Hi, Sakshi here, coming to the Ideas Festival for the first time. The comments that I sort of wanted to make was that, you have a story to tell, or anybody has a story to tell. The people who will be reading your story are going to be people who sort of think like you, right? So you're in some way sort of preaching to the choir, because there are people who will anyways reach out for your book because they kind of think like how you think. In today's world, especially in America, when we are so divided, how do we breach that divide, or how do we cross that divide, or how do I make somebody else read my story, try to empathize with it, have it resonate with them, just so that we can be more we instead of just me?
Thank you. So the question is, these days, oftentimes if someone is reading, whether it's your works or an author's works, they already agree with the sentiments of the author. So how do you reach?
That is exactly why education becomes important. Because in education, what you learn is not how to take sides, who's good guy and who's the bad guy, but knowledge in and of itself, to have that knowledge, and to understand that the world is a complex place. and things are not as simplified. We can that creates a mindset that is independent, that can go to the voting thing and vote well. When I was teaching, to combat exactly what you said, because my students, they wanted to read what would affirm them. And I would always bring the example of Alice in Wonderland, that a good reader is one who goes into follows that white rabbit and doesn't ask, where is he taking me? And jumps down that hole after the white rabbit because you want to discover something new. Literature and art is always about the other. It is always about the other. It is so bloody boring to talk about yourself, read about yourself, think about yourself, write about yourself, love yourself unconditionally. We need to look at others and to go under the skin of others. So colleges should become a place where you read everyone. In college, you read Mein Kampf by Hitler. Why? Because it is about not just judgment, but understanding, so that the next Hitler cannot come, you know? I mean, you need to read these people to understand them in order to resist them and fight them. And you need to fight them. You need to fight them.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's end with that last question.
That lady has been.
Yes. Right up here. Yeah. Let's just wait for the mic. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Marjan. I'm also an Iranian American, and I want to thank you for what you do to echo the voices of Iranian people and to be a voice. And you know, you should all know that there are so many other writers and celebrities who refuse to do that because they refuse to see this as an existential issue, but they see it as a political activity, and they shy away from it. So I really want to commend you and thank you for what you do. I just wanted to reflect on what the gentleman was saying about the narrative fatigue, the fatigue that comes with being always the storyteller and the one who is raising awareness about the issues. The other side of it is also the possibility of the audience fatigue, especially when they hear about human rights violations. Some of these stories are so difficult and so violent and gruesome that the audience just wants to turn off and doesn't want to hear about it anymore. Those people who follow the feeds of activists and citizen journalists in Iran and other conflicted regions, I am afraid that they are tuning out because the level of adversity and challenges that they face is so intense.
Right.
How do you overcome that?
Thank you. So the question is often sort of going off that question of story fatigue, exhaustion from being the person to share a story or advocate for an issue. On the other side, how do you combat audience fatigue? So when people who receive these stories and this information get exhausted by the sheer volume of what can be very difficult content.
It would be very difficult content, and of course, the stories have to be true. Not real, but true. They have to have that kind of a power in them to overcome audience fatigue. But a lot of it also depends on the audience, right? I mean, how they react matters as much. Because if someone is fatigued with my stories, there isn't much I can do about it. I can ask them, what is it about the stories that is not registering, you know? But I can't change them. It's very difficult.
Yeah, there's a level of mindfulness in the consuming of stories that we also have to hold.
Yeah.
Well, Azar, Nafisi, you are quite a powerful storyteller, and we appreciate you sharing your story and your time with us. And thank you all for making the time. If we can give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll bring to you all. But
yes, thank you. So stay well, and thank you so much for tuning in, and to everyone tuning in online.